Chapter 1: The Arrival. I never wanted the doll. It came wrapped in brown paper, tied with string, and left on my front porch without a note or an explanation. Just a strange package waiting for me on a rainy afternoon. I should have thrown it away right then. But I didn't. Curiosity got the better of me. I brought it inside, shaking off the rain, and set it on the kitchen table. The package was surprisingly light. My fingers hesitated on the string, a strange unease settling in my chest. But I pulled the knot loose and unfolded the paper. The doll inside was small, no more than a foot tall. It wore a faded dress of deep crimson, trimmed with lace that had yellowed over time. Its porcelain face was cracked in places, giving it the appearance of something ancient and forgotten. The eyes were the worst part, glassy and dark, reflecting the dim kitchen light in a way that made them seem alive. I shivered, suddenly regretting my decision to open the package. The doll looked old, like something you'd find in an attic or an antique shop. There was something unsettling about it. Something wrong. Who would leave this here? I muttered to myself, turning the doll over in my hands. There were no markings, no names. Nothing to indicate where it had come from or who it belonged to. I set it down and stepped back, rubbing my arms to chase away the chill creeping over me. The rain outside tapped against the windows, and the house felt unusually quiet. Too quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep. The storm raged outside, wind howling through the trees, and the doll lingered in my thoughts. I had left it on the table, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw its glassy eyes staring back at me. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and went downstairs to get a glass of water. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. As I reached the kitchen, I stopped in my tracks. The doll wasn't on the table. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I had left it there. I was sure of it. Slowly, I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The rain continued to beat against the windows, but inside, everything was still. And then I saw it. The doll was sitting on the floor, propped up against one of the kitchen chairs, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My breath caught in my throat. How had it moved? I hadn't touched it since the afternoon. Must have fallen, I whispered to myself, though I knew it hadn't. It was too perfectly placed, too deliberate. But I didn't want to think about the alternative. I picked the doll up carefully, avoiding its unsettling gaze, and placed it back on the table. Then I turned and hurried back upstairs, refusing to look back. The next morning, the doll was in the living room. It sat on the couch, its cracked face turned toward the window. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. Someone had to be playing a prank on me. There was no other explanation. I checked the doors and windows. All locked. No signs of a break-in. But the uneasy feeling in my chest grew stronger. I picked up the doll, carried it out to the backyard, and tossed it into the trash bin. The lid slammed shut with a satisfying thud, and I felt a small sense of relief. "That's the end of it," I said aloud, trying to convince myself. But it wasn't. That night, I woke to a soft tapping sound. It was faint, rhythmic, coming from somewhere downstairs. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The tapping continued, steady and relentless. Slowly, I climbed out of bed and made my way to the staircase. The house was dark, shadows stretching across the walls, and the tapping grew louder with each step I took. It led me to the living room. And there, sitting in the middle of the coffee table, was the doll. Its head was tilted to the side, a crack running down one cheek, and its dark eyes gleamed in the dim light. My blood ran cold. I had thrown it away. I had seen the bin lid close. There was no way it could be here. A chill ran down my spine as I approached it, my hands trembling. "How?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, I stood there, staring at the doll. The house was silent once more, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Slowly, I reached out to pick it up. The moment my fingers touched the porcelain, a sharp pain shot through my hand. I yanked it back with a cry, staring in disbelief at the fresh cut on my palm. Blood dripped onto the floor, staining the rug. The doll's cracked face seemed to shift, its expression almost satisfied. Panic set in. I grabbed the doll and rushed to the fireplace, throwing it into the flames without a second thought. The fire roared to life, engulfing the crimson dress and cracked porcelain. I watched as it burned, the flames licking hungrily at the cursed object. Only when the doll was reduced to ashes did I allow myself to breathe. I collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion washing over me. It was over. It had to be over. But deep down, I knew better. As the rain continued to fall outside, I glanced at the windows, half expecting to see the doll's reflection staring back at me. It wasn't there. Yet. But something told me it would be back. They always come back. Chapter 2: The Unsettling Signs. The following morning, I awoke to a strange sense of unease. The events of the previous night played on repeat in my mind, the doll's sudden appearances, the eerie tapping, the flames consuming its twisted form. It felt surreal, like a fever dream. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was over. The doll was gone. Burned to ashes. I had seen it with my own eyes. But something didn't feel right. The rain had finally stopped, and the house was bathed in soft morning light. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping coffee would chase away the lingering dread. As I poured water into the coffee maker, a movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. The rug in the living room was missing. Frowning, I walked over to where it had been the night before. The spot was bare, the wooden floorboards exposed. I glanced around, puzzled. Did I move it? No. I hadn't touched it. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe I rolled it up before throwing the doll in the fireplace? Maybe I was too tired to remember. I tried to laugh it off. Getting forgetful in your old age, Chris, I muttered to myself. But the laughter felt hollow, forced. Later that afternoon, I decided to check the trash bin in the backyard. I had to be sure the doll was gone, that there was nothing left of it. As I lifted the lid, the stench of burned fabric and porcelain hit me. Blackened fragments of the doll's dress clung to the sides of the bin, confirming what I already knew: I had destroyed it. Still, the unease didn't leave me. That night, the tapping started again. Soft and rhythmic, just like before. But this time, it wasn't coming from the window or the front door. It was coming from upstairs. I froze at the foot of the staircase, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. I had to know. Grabbing a flashlight, I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps echoing through the quiet house. The tapping led me to the guest bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently as if moved by an unseen breeze. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room was empty. Just an unmade bed, a wardrobe, and an old mirror leaning against the wall. I scanned the room, my heart pounding. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet, the tapping continued. It was coming from the mirror. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight reflecting off the glass. My own tired, pale face stared back at me, wide-eyed with fear. But then, for a fleeting second, I saw something else. A shadow behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight across the room. Empty. Nothing there. I turned back to the mirror, heart racing. My reflection was normal now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Watching me. I backed out of the room, shutting the door firmly behind me. As I descended the stairs, I tried to rationalize it. The tapping? Probably the old house settling. The shadow? A trick of the light. My mind was playing tricks on me because of the stress. Yeah. Stress. The next day, I visited my friend Sarah. She lived in town and had been a steady source of support since I moved here. Over coffee, I mentioned the doll. "I'm telling you, it was creepy," I said, stirring my cup absent-mindedly. It kept showing up in different places. I finally threw it in the fireplace. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And now you're seeing things?" I hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. It doesn't feel right. Like it's not really gone." She leaned back in her chair, studying me. "Chris, do you think it's possible you're imagining some of this? You've been under a lot of stress lately." I bristled at her suggestion. "I'm not crazy." "I didn't say that," she said gently. "But you've been through a lot. It's not uncommon to see or hear things when you're anxious." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the image of the shadow in the mirror wouldn't leave my mind. That evening, I returned home, feeling more isolated than ever. The house felt different now, darker, heavier. As I walked through the front door, I noticed the rug was back in its place. I stopped cold. I hadn't put it there. A chill ran down my spine. Slowly, I approached the living room, my footsteps muffled by the rug's thick fibers. The coffee table was exactly as I had left it, the fireplace cold and empty. Then I saw it. Sitting on the mantel, right above the fireplace, was the doll. Its crimson dress was untouched by the flames. The crack on its porcelain face was gone. And those glassy, dark eyes, they were staring right at me. My hands trembled as I backed away. This wasn't possible. I had destroyed it. I had seen it burn. The tapping started again. This time, it was coming from the doll itself. The rhythmic sound echoed through the silent house, filling every corner with dread. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the tapping grew louder, relentless. I stumbled back against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced for an explanation, but there was none. The doll was back. And it wasn't going anywhere. Finally, the tapping stopped. I lowered my hands, my heartbeat slowing just enough for me to think clearly. I had to get rid of it again. But how? Burning it hadn't worked. Tossing it in the trash hadn't worked. What else could I do? The doll remained motionless on the mantel, watching me. Waiting. I grabbed it with shaking hands, resisting the urge to throw it across the room. Instead, I stuffed it into a bag, tied it tight, and drove out to the edge of town. There, near the old quarry, I tossed the bag into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. It was over. Or so I thought. When I returned home, the doll was waiting for me on the front porch. Chapter 3: The Source of the Curse. I stood frozen on my front porch, staring down at the doll. Its crimson dress gleamed under the pale porch light, pristine and untouched by the water it had been submerged in. The glassy eyes seemed to follow my every move, reflecting the growing dread in my chest. My hands trembled as I reached down to pick it up. As my fingers closed around its porcelain body, a cold shiver ran through me. It was colder than before, unnaturally so. I tried to tell myself it was just the night air, but deep down, I knew better. I carried the doll inside, setting it on the coffee table. It sat there, silent and still, but its presence seemed to fill the room. The air felt heavier, charged with an unseen tension. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The doll offered no response, but the house creaked around me, the sound echoing like a warning. I sat down on the couch, running my hands through my hair, trying to make sense of it all. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living like this, with fear clawing at my sanity. The next day, I decided to visit the local library. If the doll had some kind of history, there had to be records. Old legends, folklore, anything that could explain what was happening to me. The librarian, Mrs. Caldwell, was a frail woman with kind eyes and an air of wisdom. As I approached her desk, she looked up from her book and smiled. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm looking for information on local legends. Something about cursed objects or dolls." I felt ridiculous saying it out loud, but desperation pushed me forward. Mrs. Caldwell's smile faltered. "Dolls, you say?" "Yes. Have you heard of anything like that?" She nodded slowly, her gaze turning distant. "There's an old tale, one that dates back to the founding of this town. They called it the Red Bride." "The Red Bride?" Mrs. Caldwell stood and motioned for me to follow her. We walked through the maze of shelves until we reached a section filled with dusty, leather-bound books. She pulled one out and handed it to me. This book contained stories and folklore from Haven's early days. The Red Bride was said to be a woman who made a deal with a dark entity to bring back her lost love. But the deal came at a cost. What kind of cost? I asked, flipping through the pages. She was cursed to wander forever, trapped inside a vessel of porcelain. The doll, they say, was created to house her spirit. And it always finds its way back to its owner. A chill ran down my spine. Is there a way to break the curse? Mrs. Caldwell shook her head. The stories are vague. Some say you have to bury it on sacred ground. Others say it must be passed to someone willingly. But one thing is certain, you can't destroy it. The spirit will always return. I thanked her and left the library, the book clutched tightly in my hands. My mind raced with possibilities. Burying it seemed risky. What if someone else found it? Passing it on to someone else felt even worse. I couldn't condemn another person to this nightmare. When I got home, the doll was gone. Panic set in. I searched the entire house, checking every room, every corner. Nothing. It had vanished. I tried to tell myself it was over, that maybe the spirit had moved on. But that night, as I lay in bed, the tapping returned. It was louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the front door or the window. It was coming from inside the house. I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the hallway. The tapping led me to the basement door. I hadn't been down there in weeks, but now, the door stood slightly ajar, a faint glow emanating from the darkness below. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open and descended the stairs. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and mildew. The glow grew stronger as I reached the bottom. There, in the center of the room, was the doll. It sat on an old wooden chair, its glassy eyes reflecting the dim light. The crimson dress looked brighter, almost new. And as I approached, the tapping stopped. Why? I whispered, stepping closer. Why me? The doll's head tilted, ever so slightly, as if acknowledging my question. Then, without warning, the glow intensified, casting strange shadows across the walls. The symbols I had seen in the library book appeared, etched into the floor around the doll. A voice echoed in the darkness, low and guttural. The deal must be fulfilled. I stumbled back, heart pounding. What deal? I didn't make any deal. The voice continued, relentless. The curse was passed to you. The keeper must remain. Images flooded my mind, the Red Bride, her sorrowful face twisted with rage and despair. The deal she had made. The endless cycle of torment. No, I whispered. I won't do it. I won't be the keeper. The glow faded, and the basement was plunged into darkness. The doll sat motionless once more, but the symbols on the floor remained, faintly glowing in the dim light. I ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. I couldn't keep living like this. There had to be a way to end it. As I sat in the kitchen, trying to calm my nerves, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was coming from the window. I turned slowly, dreading what I would see. The doll was there, on the other side of the glass, staring in at me. Chapter 4: The Final Confrontation. I couldn't move. The doll's glassy eyes stared at me through the window, unblinking and cold. My breath came in shallow gasps as dread seeped into my bones. It wasn't possible. I had left it in the basement, I had seen it sitting there. And yet, here it was, waiting for me outside my own house. I forced myself to move, backing away from the window. My mind raced with possibilities. Was I losing my mind? Was this some cruel joke? But deep down, I knew the truth. The doll wasn't just a cursed object. It was alive. And it wanted something from me. The tapping started again, slow and deliberate, echoing through the quiet night. My hands shook as I grabbed my jacket and keys. I couldn't stay here. I had to get away. Without a second thought, I ran out the back door, jumped into my car, and sped down the dark, empty streets of Haven. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to put distance between myself and that thing. The town blurred past me, streetlights casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward my car, as if trying to pull me back. The rain started again, droplets splattering against the windshield, making it harder to see. As I drove, my thoughts returned to the librarian's words. The Red Bride had made a deal. A deal that couldn't be undone. The spirit trapped in the doll would always find its way back. But there had to be a way to stop it. There had to be. Suddenly, the car skidded, tires screeching on the wet road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was me. Or rather, a twisted version of me. The figure's face was pale and gaunt, eyes sunken and lifeless. It wore the same clothes I had on, but they hung loosely on its skeletal frame. The reflection of my own face stared back at me, distorted and wrong. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the woods on the side of the road. I shook my head, gripping the steering wheel tighter. No. This isn't real, I whispered to myself. This can't be real. But the figure remained, unmoving, pointing. Slowly, I opened the car door and stepped out, the rain soaking through my clothes. My footsteps squelched in the mud as I approached the figure. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure's lips twisted into a grotesque smile. The deal must be fulfilled. Before I could react, the figure vanished, leaving only the dark, silent woods before me. My pulse raced as I stood there, unsure of what to do next. Then, from deep within the trees, I heard it, the unmistakable tapping sound. I knew I shouldn't follow it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, get back in the car, and drive as far away as possible. But something pulled me forward. Some invisible force that I couldn't resist. The trees closed in around me, their gnarled branches stretching overhead like skeletal fingers. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, guiding me deeper into the forest. My flashlight cast eerie shadows on the ground, illuminating the twisted roots and scattered leaves. Finally, I reached a clearing. In the center stood an old stone altar, weathered by time and covered in strange symbols, the same symbols I had seen in the basement. And there, sitting atop the altar, was the doll. Its crimson dress gleamed in the moonlight, and its dark eyes locked onto mine. The air around me grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing. "You can't keep running," the doll's voice echoed in my mind. "The deal must be fulfilled." My hands balled into fists. "I never made a deal. I don't want any part of this." The doll's head tilted, its cracked face seeming to shift into a twisted grin. "But you did. The moment you accepted me into your home, you became part of the curse." Memories flooded my mind, the package left on my porch, my decision to bring the doll inside, my repeated attempts to destroy it. Each act had bound me tighter to the curse. Desperation clawed at me. There has to be a way to end this. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. The symbols on the altar began to glow, casting an eerie light on the clearing. "The curse cannot be broken," the doll said. "Only transferred." I froze. Transferred? To someone else. Someone who willingly takes it. My mind raced. I thought of Sarah, the librarian, the people in town. I couldn't do that to them. I couldn't pass this nightmare on to someone else. But the alternative was clear. If I didn't transfer the curse, I would be trapped. Forever. The doll's voice softened, almost coaxing. "There's always a choice. All you have to do is offer it to someone. They must accept it willingly." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No. I won't do it." The whispers turned to laughter, cold and mocking. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam with malevolent delight. "Then you will remain the keeper of the red bride." The symbols on the altar flared brighter, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. I doubled over, gasping for breath as the curse took hold. The last thing I saw before darkness consumed me was the doll's twisted smile. When I woke, I was back in my living room. The doll sat on the coffee table, just as it always had. But something was different now. I could feel it, the curse had taken root. And I was its keeper. Chapter 5, The Eternal Keeper. The air in the house felt heavier, colder, like a storm waiting to break. The doll sat motionless on the coffee table, its cracked porcelain face turned toward me. The whispers had faded, but their echo lingered in my mind. I sat on the couch, staring at the doll. My body felt weak, drained from the night's events. The realization settled in my chest like a stone: I was now the keeper. The curse was mine to bear. For hours, I sat in silence, the weight of my new reality pressing down on me. The doll never moved, never spoke, but its presence filled every corner of the room. I could feel it watching, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I stumbled to my bedroom and collapsed onto the bed, sleep pulling me under like a tidal wave. I woke to tapping. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The tapping wasn't coming from the door or the window. It was coming from inside the house. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept down the hallway. The tapping guided me to the living room. The doll was still on the coffee table, but the sound wasn't coming from it. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. My pulse quickened as I crouched down, pressing my ear to the floor. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. With trembling hands, I pried up one of the loose floorboards. A cold draft hit my face, and I shined the flashlight into the dark space below. There, nestled among the dirt and debris, was a small, weathered box. The tapping stopped the moment I touched it. I lifted the box out and set it on the floor. It was old, the wood cracked and splintered, but the symbols carved into its surface were unmistakable, the same symbols I had seen on the altar in the woods. With a deep breath, I opened the box. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a woman in a crimson wedding dress, her face hidden beneath a veil. Beside the photograph was a piece of parchment, the ink faded but still legible. To become the keeper is to protect the lost. To refuse is to condemn them to wander. The words sent a chill down my spine. I lifted the photograph, and underneath it, I found a name written in careful script. Margaret Hale. My mind raced. Margaret Hale, the Red Bride. The woman who had made the original deal. The spirit trapped inside the doll. I had to know more. I took the photograph and parchment to the library, hoping Mrs. Caldwell could help me piece together the story. When I arrived, the librarian looked up from her desk, her eyes widening in recognition. "Chris. You look like you've seen a ghost." I placed the photograph and parchment on the desk. "I need to know everything about Margaret Hale." Mrs. Caldwell's expression darkened. She glanced around, lowering her voice. Margaret Hale was one of the founding members of this town. She was set to marry a man named Thomas Larkin, but tragedy struck. He drowned at sea just days before the wedding. I nodded, urging her to continue. Grief-stricken, Margaret turned to forbidden practices. She sought out a way to bring him back. The legend says she made a deal with a dark entity, promising to guide lost souls in exchange for her love's return. "And the doll?" I asked. Mrs. Caldwell sighed. "The doll was created as a vessel for her spirit. But the deal went wrong. Instead of bringing Thomas back, Margaret became trapped. Her soul bound to the doll, cursed to wander forever." I sat back, my mind reeling. Is there a way to break the curse? The librarian shook her head. "Not that I know of. The curse can only be transferred. Someone must willingly accept it." I left the library, the weight of the curse pressing down on me. There had to be a way out. I couldn't condemn someone else to this fate, but I couldn't keep living like this either. That night, I returned home to find the doll waiting for me on the porch. It sat there, silent and still, its dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the cold porcelain sending a shiver down my spine. "I'm not going to be your keeper," I whispered. "I won't do it." The doll's head tilted slightly, as if mocking me. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling my mind with their insidious chant. You accepted the deal. You are the keeper. No! I shouted, throwing the doll across the yard. It landed in the grass, motionless. But the whispers didn't stop. As I stood there, the air grew colder, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Margaret Hale, her crimson dress billowing in the wind. Her veil lifted, revealing hollow, sunken eyes. You cannot escape, she said, her voice a chilling echo. The lost will always need a guide. I backed away, my heart pounding. I don't want this. I never asked for this. Margaret stepped closer. And yet, you accepted it. The moment you brought me inside, the curse became yours. Tears streamed down my face. There has to be another way. She shook her head. The only way to end it is to pass the curse. Or to remain the keeper forever. I fell to my knees, defeated. The whispers surrounded me, their chant growing louder. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Margaret faded into the mist, leaving me alone with the doll. I picked it up, cradling it in my arms. The porcelain felt warm now, almost comforting. I was the keeper. And I would be forever.